I mean, it was essentially the ego was terrified of letting go of control. And I think we all know that state.
Mm-hmm.
And it did crescendo into this moment where I kind of had some kind of, breakthrough moment, that powerful fulcrum where I quit. I just gave up, and gave up not into passivity, but just like, I am over the fighting with myself. I am not prepared to continue this fight, this internal fight. It's too exhausting and it's not serving anyone.
Hello, beautiful people. On today's podcast, we have the beautiful Claire Dunn. Claire was a former environmental campaigner for the Wilderness Society. With growing interest in the psychology of the human-nature connection, Claire immersed herself in deep ecology, wilderness survival and nature awareness skills, rewilding, Jungian psychology, yoga, somatic psychotherapy, and nature soul encounter practices. Claire offers reconnecting and rewilding workshops and retreats and personal mentoring sessions. Claire also holds a degree in media and communications and has been a freelance journalist since 2001. She is the author of 2 books, My Year Without Matches, Escaping the City in Search of the Wild, and Rewilding the Urban Soul. What I personally love about this conversation is Claire's beautiful presence and energy that she authentically embodies. In 2010, Claire embarked on a year of nature immersion, completing an independent wilderness studies program. And it is in this conversation that she shares deeply about such an immersive and defining experience. Claire, upon realizing the distance between what she was trying to save through the Wilderness Society and the life she was living, took a leap of courage into nature and found that what she was longing for was also longing for her. Through living in the flow of nature, Claire's old trauma patterns and parts of her pain body began to reveal themselves. Her voice of self-judgment became louder, and the internal fight between the doer and her new self was emerging. Claire shares about the importance of rewilding and the significant difference from rewinding. And one of my personal favorite lessons from this conversation is her concept of freedom, and how this, through the absence of fear and resistance, we can experience if we so choose. Please enjoy this beautiful conversation with the connected Claire Dunn. Welcome to the To Be Human podcast, Claire.
Thanks, Jennah-Louise. It's really wonderful to be here with you this morning.
It's wonderful to have you. So, Claire, I want to start with a quote from your book, My Year Without Matches. And you wrote, "What really needed saving here? Was I too busy saving something else to see what was dying within? Something just as wild, just as threatened, something only I could save. I'd been doing too much talking. It was time for me to listen to what the forest had to say, what it wanted me to do, to immerse myself in its culture, its language, its law. But that was unrealistic, impossible. The time for wild adventures had passed. It was one thing when I was young, and another when all my friends were packing away their revolutionary caps and getting real jobs, marriage certificates, mortgages, babies. It was a time for consolidation, for settling. I'd be fine after a break. If I could just get through this election and take a holiday, I'd be ready for the next fight." So I would love for you to share, Claire, what your life was like before you decided to immerse yourself into a wild adventure.
Thank you. That quote really moved me, actually.
It obviously moved me too. It was beautiful.
It's funny, I kind of feel this, that was like 10 years ago, and I feel like I'm ready for the next wild adventure now. So that sentiment that I was expressing there really takes me back to the time where I was really faced with a crossroads in my life. I was about 27, 28 and had spent most of my adult life dedicating myself to environmental causes, really pouring my passion into conservation work, forest conservation work, local grassroots environmental organizations, after I'd kind of discovered the ecological crisis when I left home and went to university and started to actually open my eyes to the wider circles of my identity, the wider circles of my existence. And it's like, wow, okay, the earth isn't in such a good shape. And it became an imperative to, do something about that. But of course, the doing something about that is, in traditional activism, it's involved in that same political cycle, that same election cycle, that same kind of baseline values of the fight, like I used in that quote, fighting and doing more, and that kind of almost violent kind of violence to the body in a way, that sense of the urgency. And so at that time, I started to really open myself and feel a call to a more spiritually aligned life, and felt this distance between what I was trying to save and the life that I was living. There was this big kind of disconnect, and realized that what I really needed to attend to first was healing that rift of separation in myself between self and nature, between nature and culture. And it wasn't, at the time, it wasn't so kind of understood in such a kind of cognitive way as I understand it now. It was more like this inextricable pull away from the kind of to-do lists, and away from the kind of strategy mind, and towards a more essential, a more original, a more traditional earth-based spirituality. And that call came to me in the form of dreams. It came to me in the form of these earth skills, ancestral life ways that I started to be exposed to. It came to me in the form of craving a sense of present time and deep time, a sense of being really immersed in a wild landscape, and knowing that the wild self within me is what I really needed to attend to. Even though I was trying to save the wild out there, the wild inside me had still become tamed and domesticated and bulldozed and cultivated like the rest of society around me. So it was that realization of coming back to that, which was, that crossroads, and that very kind of fierce and brave and radical and crazy decision to leave everything behind, leave my job with the Wilderness Society, leave my partner, leave my community, leave my home by the sea, and enter into this kind of deep immersion when I was 31.
I think it's so powerful, and I feel like so many people can resonate with that feeling that you're expressing. But I think such a big difference is so many of us don't actually explore that. We don't actually take action and trying to truly see what that means. And you certainly did. You spent a year in the wilderness. And I'd love to know, Claire, what influenced you in taking that step? Because it certainly was a big step. It's a defining step. I feel like it just completely changed the trajectory of your life and who you are now. And I'd love to know, I think particularly for the listeners that are resonating with what you're sharing right now, what helps to be able to actually have the courage, I think it's courage, to be able to explore that?
Yeah, certainly. It's a big leap. And I know that the leap for me was in a very particular trajectory that not many people are going to choose. But being a mentor myself now, I recognize that same leap that others feel a call to make in different ways in their life. And so your question around what supported me to kind of make that leap is a really good one. Partly it was like mentors and elders. And sometimes that was in the form of books. And also it was in the form of people that I met who were kind of beckoning me, showing me a different path. And I think those mentors and stepping stones are vitally important. All you really need is a sense of something else being possible, and some kind of hand reaching for you, saying, actually, this what you're yearning for, what you're longing for, is real. You just really need someone to mirror back to you. Actually, what you're longing for is longing for you. And I really believe that. It was like the wild was longing for me as I was longing for the wild. My soul was longing for the wild. But I don't know whether I would have made that leap if I hadn't met some mentors along the way who started kind of introducing me and inviting me deeper into this kind of earth-based spirituality and shamanic practice. And also a book I came across, Bill Plotkin's first book, Soulcraft, which really rocked my world. It is kind of a guidebook into the mysteries of nature and psyche and that crossover. And turning the pages was like, it's like he'd written it for me, that feeling of just like, oh, this is the thing. And also it was with, the inner resources of my own wild heart, my own courage. And I really had to confront a lot of uncertainty and a lot of doubt in myself and just hang on to that wild calling. That's so important, that sense of like, even though I don't know where I'm going to land when I make this leap, just trusting that there'll be ground underneath me.
And I'd love for you to share that evolution of, because I know in your book you talk a lot about self-judgment and the journey of truly being able to release that to some extent. And, I know that when you spent a year in the wilderness, this was 10 years ago, and obviously you've grown a lot since then. But I think it's really important to sort of go back there because so much of your growth, it seems, really like was consolidated through that immersion of spending a year in the wilderness. So I'd love to know, you make this big leap, you decide to go out into the wilderness for a year. What happens with your element of like self-judgment and self-reflection? Because obviously there was a really big transformation in that.
Yeah, that's right. I wasn't expecting, this is the thing, we have ideas about what transformation looks like, and it's usually not what's required of us, but maybe we'd never make the leap if we knew. Transformation, requires a kind of dissolution of the old self. And what I was really calling in wasn't an initiatory journey. It wasn't just a kind of nice year in the woods. And, that kind of care for what you wish for. What I really did experience was such a confronting mirror to the way that I'd been conditioned through my family and through culture to assess my worth or my value based on what I achieved during the day, just this kind of Protestant work ethic, this sense of the doing nature. And it can get so slippery with when it entwines with passions, because I also had absolute passion for these earth skills and for the nature observation and awareness and the ceremonial work I was doing out there. But when that gets kind of a bit entwined with the doing mind and the like seduction of productivity, and how as women especially, we're really conditioned into being perfectionists. And so I was kind of like a perfectionist in recovery that year. It was like breaking the addiction to perfection, which sounds strange when my only job description out there was like shelter, water, fire, and food in many ways. But it's amazing how you take yourself anywhere and there you are. And there was all my self-critic just telling me I wasn't doing this properly. It wasn't up to scratch. I wasn't ticking the boxes. I wasn't being venturous enough or disciplined enough or radical enough. And so I really came to see that the real task out there was breaking this addiction to perfection and coming into a kind of a relationship with my wild feminine nature, which is more about feeling and flow and impulse and really following the kind of the feeling body, the energetic body, being in my body, being in my heart, really letting my actions come from that deepest place of rightness within me, not from some external kind of validation. And that took quite a lot of, internal work actually, and quite a lot of pain. And as the old towers crumbled. Yeah.
And what did that look like? Because as you said, a lot of us may not sort of step into something like this if we truly know what it looks like. But I think also, as you have shared, maybe we would with the support of mentors and other people that have been through an experience like this. And I know that you speak of Earth being, a true healer for us. What does it look like sort of being out amongst the elements and having, old trauma come up or, present trauma come up? How do you sort of move through that whilst out there? Like, what does that look like?
Well, it looked quite messy at times. I guess I wasn't prepared for the way that trauma moves through the system. I wasn't trauma informed back then at all, and I have had pretty much no understanding of how trauma moves through the body, through the system, through the nervous system at all. So it was an absolute shock to kind of find that when I really slowed down, when I quietened myself, when I became very, very sensitive, because I was doing lots of sensitizing practices. I was spending most of my time alone. I was really immersing myself in the more than human world. And there's, the forest is always in flow. It's just itself. It's just being itself, always flowing. And when you put yourself in that environment, it's like via osmosis or something, that my system, all the stuck places in me, just wanted to flow as well, which sounds lovely. But actually what it looked like at times was these old trauma patterns and pain, like parts of my pain body, started to shift and move. And I became really emotional and at times like discovering my anger and grief and sadness that was clearly coming from old trauma in childhood. And so it was, and I didn't have an understanding of it at the time. So how I processed it was through the body, I'd move like a dance. I'd dance it out on the landscape. I'd let the tears flow. I'd let the anger out through my body. It had to be embodied. And that was just a knowing. It had to be embodied. And just trying to kind of trust that there was some healing happening here. But at the time, it's really challenging without teachers and mentors to kind of know what's happening. And now having held people in those spaces for many years, I really understand the relationship between those deep immersive experiences and healing and trauma. And I wish I knew now I wish I knew then what I know now. But look, it was a trial by initiation, but it certainly unlocked all those places in me that needed healing.
And do you think that that's sort of like a representation? Like when you speak about that, what comes to me personally is almost like an intuitive surrender. As you're saying, you're sort of like, you've got that energy within you that you're moving sort of with like within you. And it's like, okay, maybe you don't have the mentors and you haven't been informed, but there was like this inner knowing also of sort of how to heal yourself out in nature.
Yeah. I mean, I think the most powerful times for me is when I was forced into, in a way, or did manage to really trust the movement of my body and my emotional body and enter into that place of surrender, which is also when those states of absolute rapture and ecstasy and like I felt myself as part of the vast web of life and really knew myself as just one creature on this wild planet. But and that's partly the beauty of those difficult states, is when you surrender into them, there's such a, those cycles of kind of dissolution move through you and breaking down, and then the surrender opens up that void space, which is quite exquisite at times, but also quite scary at times and terrifying. yeah, the whole experience really opened up my emotional body to kind of experiences and states that I'd never been in before. Much deeper, much more expansive. Yeah.
And I'd love for you to share, I know in your book you shared a story about sort of screaming or expressing like I quit, and then sort of waking up the next day and being accountable to sort of this like freedom of expression. I would love for you to share that story, because to me as a reader and a learner, I really loved that story in the sense of, I think as you're talking about, the healing can be cyclical, and at some point you can have that inner knowing and really be in that moment and feel so free, but then the next day you may feel a little differently, and it's kind of that that journey of sort of trying to stay true to sort of what you're seeking.
Yeah, that moment was really powerful. I'm glad you reminded me of it. It was like, the build up to the monsoon kind of feeling, like that internal fight going on between the doer within me and then the new self that was trying to emerge, that just purely wanted to be in beingness. It wanted to be in that wild feminine, and the old was just fighting it. I mean, it was essentially the ego was terrified of letting go of control. And I think we all know that state. Mm-hmm. And it did crescendo into this moment where I kind of had some kind of, breakthrough moment, that powerful fulcrum where I quit. I just gave up, and gave up not into passivity, but just like, I'm over the fighting with myself. I am not prepared to continue this fight, this internal fight. It's too exhausting and it's not serving anyone. And I remember waking up the next morning and it was like a new world. It was like emerging from my thatched shelter to this beautiful world where, the dewdrops on the leaves and the sound of the birds was just exquisite. And the taste of my morning cup of tea was just like the best thing. And just this freedom, this feeling of, I don't have to be anywhere and I don't have to do anything. I am literally free to move with whatever feels right for me. And there was this kind of period of time, I don't know, maybe it was a week or so, where that true freedom lasted, before some of the old structures started to kind of pull me down again. But it was never the same again since. It hasn't been the same, that I really did let go in that moment into a much more fluid way of being, a much more kind of, I call it the wild feminine way of being. And in that, when something's like, it's like you're back in the east, that birthing place, that place of the dawn where the new beginnings are possible. And the old patterns of the old towers have crumbled, and just that exquisite freshness and innocence of a new way of being. And I think I had such a great time. It was like, wow, I just think I'm going to lie around and read my book for a while. And of course, the ego fears nothing getting done. It fears just kind of chaos and entropy and inertia. But in actual fact, when you kind of surrender into that more essential place, then what's most true comes through, and for a while that could look like just kind of sitting around doing nothing. But of course, then what starts to surface is the real impulses to, for me, like weave a basket or go for a really long overnight wander or to write a letter to someone, or, that more intuitive kind of way of being that muscle starts being strengthened.
And how do you maintain sort of that sense of freedom in your daily life? Because sort of, on the topic of what we're talking about, I think a lot of us have had at least one experience in our life when we truly feel sort of that feeling of true freedom, and I feel like of like reconnecting with our inner self or our true self. And I've certainly had experiences like that in nature, but I know this is part of your work, then we go back into our day-to-day lives and it feels different and it's a little clunky, and very quickly, if you're not on top of it, you can sort of go back into your old patterns and your own old ways. So I'd love to know, particularly as a mentor yourself as well, how do you advise people to sort of try and maintain that connectedness with those moments of freedom that we do experience?
It's a really good question. And of course, I don't live in that space right now where I can just do whatever I want without, I didn't have a phone, I didn't have a laptop. I mean, I was really free. And so now running a business and I live in the city, and all the demands of work and social life and family life and partnered life. And I've gone from like not owning any keys to now having a full set of keys, all the responsibilities. Yeah, I think for me, it's important to recognize always that it's all a choice. And partly that's coming from a privileged, white middle-class perspective. But I recognize that I have the privilege to make choices to a certain degree of what I do with my life and how I spend my days. And so for me, that even just recognizing that choice, like it's my choice today to work in this way. It's my choice to engage in this work that is my passion, and really coming back to like anchoring in, like that kind of vow that keeps me going of serving the earth and serving all the wild creatures. And so even though sometimes I don't feel like working, the kind of greater value is of contributing. But it's also a matter of kind of catching myself sometimes and like, okay, where's the kind of balance here? And so prioritizing my own time alone in nature, at least an hour a day. And I need that hour a day where I'm out in nature and I don't have my phone and I'm walking or I'm sitting at my sit spot and I'm really tuning into the unseen realms and to the elements and to the way the patterns in the landscape move and the bird language. And that's incredibly important, to not lose sight of that. And recognizing, there's one of my mentors still tells me that creation mind, as he calls it, is available even when you're answering emails, so that timeless space that I was so lucky to be immersed in for a year, that timeless space can be accessed in a moment, on the out breath, and that gap between the out breath and the in breath, that contains all of time and space. So just recognizing those, it's partly a choice in each moment to recognize that timelessness is available to us. Yeah. But I also think it is a discipline in these times to not let the tools like the laptop and the phone run us, to actually use the tools for our purposes, and to just clearly make a choice, like what are my needs and what are the world's needs and where do they overlap, and to make those really clear, conscious choices about our time and attention, which is really the greatest gift we can give the world.
Yeah, that was definitely one of the more powerful lessons in a similar way that I learned this year. Is, I am very much someone, backpacked to almost 50 countries, and certainly a lot of that had to do with, in my younger years, I was certainly seeking something that was always within. But, there's like vivid memories of, being in the mountains in Nepal, or, certain countries and places that I feel nostalgic for now and then, that feeling that I had, that connectedness that I know that's so important to you as well. And I mean, everyone, but your teachings and the lesson I learned this year is what you're talking about, is like, whatever that feeling and that connectedness that I feel in those moments is available to me right now. I have access to that right now. And that was really big for me, because I think I was always someone that was like, okay, I'll, be in this space, and then like I'll feel this feeling when I go over here, or I'll go traveling. And I think particularly during COVID, a lot of us that are more inclined like that have felt an emptiness that we haven't been able to fulfill, in the lack of knowing that we have access to those feelings in any moment that we choose.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I know it's been incredibly challenging for so many people in the lack of freedom. And, Melbourne's there's been in lockdown for the longest time of any city in the world. And so I am witnessing in my community quite a lot of deep grief and isolation. And I'm also witnessing the kind of connectedness that comes from slowing down and that comes from maybe the greater joy. And as I get older, I crave this more than the kind of peaks of the mountains necessarily. The greater joy that comes from like really deepening our connections with place where we are. There's something so exquisite about knowing the individual birds in our backyard, like knowing the patterns of the birds in my veggie patch and near my letterbox, and almost greeting them by name, and recognizing when the migratory sacred kingfisher comes back to the river where I live on. And those things can only be known and cultivated through slowing down and through deep time in one's own environment. And for me, I think that's a deeper satisfaction than the kind of peak experiences. Yes, there's something about being in a different landscape and being in a different culture that is so enlivening. But I'm really catching stories in my community of how the lockdowns have facilitated that deeper, slower, more earth-timed sense of belonging. And belonging is really, really what we're longing for. We're longing for belonging, essentially. And so it has really facilitated a movement towards that, in a way that's more localized and less globalized.
I absolutely agree. And I know that you're so passionate about the concepts of connection and disconnection. And I'd love for you to share more about that, because I know that in your writings you speak about it so beautifully. And it's, I feel like it's the truth of who we are, because those words resonate so deeply. So I'd love for you to share more about this idea of, because I think some people may not truly understand, like, what do you mean between the disconnection and connection with ourselves and others and of Earth as well?
Yeah, I mean, that is really my passion, is cultivating greater connection, because greater connection really is what cultivates the emergence of our gifts. And when we're really living our gifts, then culture starts to change. Then we see a kind of renaissance of life-affirming culture. So that's where it's kind of coming from. But what I mean by kind of disconnection, I guess, is the experience of much of Western culture, which for various, historic reasons, has meant that we experience life in a really different way to our ancestors. We experience being in the world in this kind of a little bit bubble wrapped, a bit kind of like a separate orbiting, satelliting being that has, some threads of connection to others and to the more than human world, but they're a bit thin and they're a bit tenuous. It's that individualistic kind of competitive power over structure that we don't even know. We don't even know because we don't have anything to compare it to. But what I'm passionate about is starting to wake up our connectivity system. And you think of our ancestry, living in close intimacy with the earth, living within a village structure, living within a culture that encourages transitions through, life stage transitions, that encourages the full maturing, the full flowering of a human being. And what I understand about Western culture is that we're kind of stuck in a kind of patho-adolescent culture where we're mostly concerned about our own security and our family's security, but really not particularly connected in to our unique gifts that we've come into this world with. We haven't gone through that initiatory cycle of life. And that is predicated upon a deep and abiding relationship with the more than human world. So one of the tasks that I see is really urgent and essential is waking up our connectivity system. So that is like these threads and ropes out to the more than human world, where we develop relationships with the ecology of the area, with the weather patterns. We develop this kind of sense of awe and reverence for just being alive. We develop that childlike electricity in our body, excitement at the changing seasons and discoveries in nature. But moreover, it's not just about us and nature, it's about weaving nature and culture together. So it's about sharing those stories with others. It's about those old technologies of village building. We bring those back again, the rituals, the ceremonies, the potluck dinners, the extended families, sharing our stories of the day. So just these simple connections, what they do is they start like turning that wheel of human development. So we start being connected, then we start feeling the call for a deep immersion in more than human world. We start feeling the call to initiation. And through that comes this surfacing of our gifts, comes the kind of like just natural desire to serve the earth community, not as a kind of cognitive exercise, but as just something that bubbles up. How can I best contribute to the earth community? Our actions just naturally tend towards care for each other, for the environment, but that only comes through being connected. So it's really this word rewilding that I use, and part of the title of my latest book. This is a big part of what I understand the human rewilding movement is. It's not about rewinding. It's not going back to hunter-gatherer culture. It's really about reweaving nature and culture back together again, rather than the kind of way it's been separated out through our kind of Western scientific model of understanding life. Now we're bringing them back together, nature and culture back together, so that we can shift into a life-affirming culture, because that's absolutely the way we need to go if we're going to live on any kind of healthy planet right now.
Yeah, I loved in your book, you shared an image of imagine if we tore down the walls of our neighbors and we turned the couches around to face each other and have a conversation. I truly loved that, because there was an inner yearning for that. And particularly reading your story, Claire, it's I just reflected on how connected am I with people and nature around me and everything that I'm a part of. And I realize I can go days without putting my feet on the ground because I'm just always wearing shoes. Or I can be inside and sort of look out the window and not even realize that it's been raining for a few hours. And these things that are when I realize them, there's almost a slight sadness to it all. And I know through reading your story, you talk about, when you spent some time in the wilderness, just being more connected with the seasons and how you change as a person throughout the seasons. And I think that's just so special and so beautiful to be that immersed and that aware of how something like the weather can move us, or something like the animals can shape us. And I guess for people that are sort of more in the introduction of things like this, and as you shared on your second book, it's more about that rewilding. It's not necessarily about going back to hunter-gatherer days, but being able to rewild in this modern type society. I know that you live in Melbourne. What are some practices that we could bring into our life? I know that you mentioned the sit spot. I'd love for you to elaborate on what does that look like? Because I know personally for me, that's certainly something that I'll be trying in my own life.
Yeah, great. Yeah, that's right. It's rewilding really is about kind of reclaiming practices and ways of living and ways of encountering the world, being in the world that we've lost, that we've forgotten, that we need for our thriving. And so just like you said, if you realize you've not really been barefoot on the earth for a while, or that you don't really know what stage the moon is in, or, there's a state of disconnection. A lot of people just don't know what the first bird of the morning is in their neighborhood, or where the moon's up to, or what the nearest edible is to their back door. really simple things. Or more importantly, even, have you had your story caught today? Has someone really, at some point during the day, is someone really going to hear your experience of being in the world? That's so vital. And that's the kind of very basic technology of village living. So these are the things I'm kind of exploring how to kind of bring these back. And so, yes, some of the simple practices are, like I mentioned, a sit spot, which is literally you find a spot that has a wildish quality within 5 or 10 minutes walk of your home, probably no more because you won't go there often enough, and make it a place that you just really want to go to. Like, just, it's your sacred spot. It's your sacred place to sit, turn your phone off, and just really open up your senses and soak in everything. Notice everything, which way the weather's coming in from, what the birds are doing. Go there at different times of the day and night. When do the plants flower? What are the changes in the seasons? I mean, it can be a really simple practice. And if you can have someone that you can share the story with, or even share a sit spot, it can really start to, it's like an anchor. It's an anchor point for like a classroom to turn the pages of the book of nature. Another really powerful practice for me is like wandering without time or destination, really wandering with that sense of timelessness. It's so rare, really, that we head out, even in our neighborhoods, and don't have a destination in mind, and just go with that sense of like curiosity and where my body radar wants to take me, because it strengthens that muscle of, the kind of somatic intuition, and just sense and feel what's happening on the landscape, and encounter the world and everything you see and come across as interested in you as you are in it. So this is kind of opening up this animistic way of being in the world, that, everything has kind of consciousness and is conversational in a different way. Just try it on, that everything is as interested in you as you are in it. And hopefully find some other kind of, nature lovers and community builders in your neighborhood, and just even start sharing some potluck dinners. If you can have a fire in your backyard, share stories of the day, share stories of your community. Just start weaving nature and culture back together again. And foraging is another really powerful practice for me. Getting to know a few wild edible weeds that are in your backyard or parklands, and start incorporating them into your diet. They're highly nutritious. And the act of foraging, like engaging with the landscape, so it starts shifting from kind of, appreciation, but kind of observer, like voyeur, to participant in, that's a really powerful practice of reconnection as well. There's so many different ways that we can start really embedding ourselves much deeper within our kind of lineage, is really our birthright of deep connection to earth and self and community.
Yeah, I love this idea. And we were talking about Miriam Lancewood before we press record, and she was on the podcast, and she has a very similar concept of, not just being the observer, but being part of nature. And as you're saying, the participant. And that's been one of my most profound lessons for this year, I think, because, we can advocate for mindfulness and meditation and being the observer, but I feel like truly the next step in that sense of connectedness is realizing that you are part of it. And it's truly beautiful. And as you're sharing, to not only be interested, but to know that it's back at you. It's interesting. It's that mirror between us, and we're all part of the same thing. And I think it's so beautiful and so powerful, and particularly during COVID, when I know a lot of us have felt some form of isolation or being alone, there's something so empowering about being able to recognize that you are part of this, you are part of the whole, you are what makes up the whole. And it's truly beautiful. And I would love to know, Claire, because I know that, 10 years ago when you made this big leap, you were truly sort of seeking this idea of what freedom meant to you. What is freedom? And I'd love to know, sort of 10 years on, has that changed for you? What does that look like now?
Mm. Well, I'll share with you a dream I had about this very question. The dream I had was I was 27, 28. So at this, just at the point of, and some people, if they're into astrology, will know this period of your life as Saturn return, where big changes happen. It's a time of initiation, really. And I had a dream at that time that I was walking through the forest looking for the power tree in the forest, and I found it, but around the back of it was a red-bellied black snake that curled itself around my leg, and I kind of pushed it away in fear. And then I walked over to a rock ledge and brought out this rock tablet that had these big words, freedom, written on it. So that dream feels to me like a life dream, a life question that I'm living out, because freedom is really what I'm seeking in myself. And that dream points for me towards an absence of fear. There was the fear of this serpent, this wild goddess serpent that I was pushing back with fear. It was like, no, don't come closer. But on the other side of that fear was true freedom. And so, from a purely kind of spiritual perspective, it's like at one end, like working on fear. So kind of chipping away at fear, because the less fear I have, the more freedom I have. But you can't just tell fear to go away. It's actually about allowing whatever is moving in me to move through me, which is something that I discovered, way back on my retreat, and something that is still a practice for me. If I can absolutely allow and accept whatever is moving through me to move through me without blocking it or resisting it, then that's where I find the kind of freedom on the other side. And it feels like the most courageous thing to do, really. It's to really fully trust the movement of self. And sometimes that means change, because we are fluid beings. But really that is the epitome of, the wild self, and using this word wild to really mean self-willed or sovereign. The wild expression of the wild self for me is one of completely trusting and feeling belonging in one's body, beautiful, in one's emotional body, and in our larger body of the earth. We're part of this larger body. So if we can really trust that whatever's moving through us is part of what's moving through the larger body, then there's this image of the archetype of the hollow bone, like the elder. They're so clear that life just moves through them like a hollow bone. It's such a beautiful metaphor. So for me, and I'm an elder in training, freedom is really becoming that hollow bone, that clear channel, free from fear, free from resistance, so life moves through me.
That is so beautiful. And I think we should leave the conversation at that. I think that's a beautiful reflection for us all to have. And I know certainly I'll be reflecting further on that today. So thank you so much, Claire, for sharing your wisdom. And I certainly see you as, an elder in training. I can certainly see you as an elder even now for people like me. And I've learned so much through your journey. And even before we pressed record, I was very grateful and thankful to people like you, particularly women like you, that share your story, because, I feel like we don't have enough stories of women sort of coming back into their own feminine archetype. And it's so empowering for people like me that want to learn from people like you. So thank you so much for sharing your beautiful journey and your beautiful stories.
Well, thank you. It was really wonderful conversation, and I can really feel the resonance with your own explorations in the wild world, and yeah, I really enjoyed your questions. So thank you, Jennah-Louise. Yeah.
So on a final note, I would love to ask you, Claire, what does it mean to you to be human?
I forgot about this trick question at the end. I'm starting to kind of relax and breathe out. What does it mean to be fully human? Well, I'm coming back to that very basic, magical trifecta of when we're experiencing deep connections to the more than human world, to a village, and therefore to ourselves, then I feel like we're embodying and inhabiting our birthright of being caretakers of the earth, of being fully human, our connectivity systems alive, animated, in awe and reverence and sacred wonder of life.